attention. But Republican nominee Roy Moore has changed that. He's been accused of sexual abuse with underage girls in his past. Despite that, he's won the endorsement of President Trump and is receiving campaign funding from the Republican National Committee. Against Moore, Democratic nominee Doug Jones, the strategy for Jones to get voters out in droves from predominantly black areas. But are they planning to show up? Joining me now is NBC's Alex Seitz-Wald, who just came back from Alabama. Alex, I am talking to people I've known on the ground for a couple of decades. My mother's family's from Alabama. I'm not hearing the enthusiasm level as high as one would expect among black counties in Alabama. What's going on down there?
Absolutely. You hear a lot of that and a lot of concerns among Democrats that African Americans are not aware or excited about this race, or at least as much as they would want them to be. This is obviously the key demographic group for Democrats in Alabama. They really need super high turnout from African Americans. There's a couple of things that I think are not working as well as they should be for Doug Jones. One is he's just not as well known. He hasn't run statewide. This is his first campaign for public office. He's really leaning on his work as a former U.S. attorney prosecuting 2 KKK members in the 16th Street Baptist church bombing years after the fact. That got him some attention in Birmingham, but not so much statewide. But he's also made a couple of mistakes, I think, in his appeal to those voters. In particular, there was this one mailer that kind of asked, what if Roy Moore was a black man and had accusations like that against him? Would anyone want him to run for the Senate? I think that kind of backfired. Yeah. Some people viewed it as condescending. The Root called it racist. So there's been some of that. And there's also just a wider sense for years that people feel like their votes have been taken for granted. They haven't been given a seat at the table. And that's all kind of coming together. At the same time, you know, there's a lot of antipathy for Roy Moore, a lot of antipathy for Donald Trump, and that might save Doug Jones in the end with African Americans.
I hear on the Republican side people saying things like, Roy Moore may not speak to my morals, but he speaks to my interests. Is any of that being said on the black community side? I'm talking now about the African-American Democratic voters saying, well, I don't like being taken for granted, and many of us feel that's the way we've been treated, but my interest is at stake because Roy Moore has said that he's embraced this whole idea that in slavery we all got along, even though slavery may have been wrong, we were all family, and so many other things that could be absolutely considered as not in the interest of the average African American.
Absolutely, and everyone that I talk to is aware of Roy Moore, has negative feelings about Roy Moore. You know, very few African Americans expected to vote for Roy Moore, and I do think it's a bit of a parallel where you might get some people who kind of reluctantly go out and vote because they do think that Doug Jones has their interest at heart, or there might be some more enthusiasm for it. But because the big question is turnout, this is going to be a low turnout race, 13 days before Christmas. They really need supercharged turnout among African Americans, and that's why the enthusiasm piece really matters.
Now, when you look at what's at stake, and I don't know that a lot of this has been communicated on the ground in Alabama. I'm getting varying reports on it. When you look, though, at what is at stake, if Roy Moore is the senator, it preserves the slight edge in the Senate majority of the Republican Party, which deals with the tax plan, which deals with rolling back the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, which confirms federal judges. When you see what's at stake in terms of what the Senate will do, and that one vote which will keep them with a razor-thin majority, or that one vote that could go the other way, which could add to a lot of blocking of what they could do with judges all the way to the Affordable Care Act. I think if that was communicated, that might energize a lot of voters to understand this is about as serious as it can get in terms of everything that Dr. King fought for all the way to Barack Obama was able to get done.
Right, but the issue with that is that Doug Jones is at the same time trying to appeal to African-American Democrats, where that message would really appeal, but he's also trying to appeal to white Republicans who are turned off by Roy Moore. So he's really distancing himself from the National Party, and he's not trying to emphasize those stakes, because there's a lot of Republicans down there who don't like Roy Moore, aren't because of these allegations, and even before that, but they want conservative judges. They want
let me hold you there.
Moved.
Let me stop you right there because I'm out of time, but let me say this. I'm told with polls that over 50% of white women say they still are going to vote for Roy Moore despite these allegations, despite he was banned from his own local mall because he was known to be running around chasing young girls. Yet the polls say the majority of white women in the state is still going to vote for him.
Well, it actually, that sounds like a high number, but if that ends up being the turnout on Tuesday, that could work for Jones. Republicans typically get more like 80% or 70% of white women, so he'll need a lot of those voters at the same time that he's trying to turn out African Americans.
He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, an outlier for a judicial system that has time and again seen police officers exonerated in cases of alleged police misconduct. While I'm heartened by the verdict, I cannot bring myself to rejoice as fully as some cynics and critics might expect. Critics and cynics who will surely contend that we in the social justice community should look at the verdict as evidence that the system works if given time. But for the mother of Tamir Rice or the father of Michael Brown, a friend of Sandra Bland and one of Terrence Crutch's 4 children or Eric Garner's family, time is all they have, if it ever brings them to any comfort at all. And just as the censor of 1 or even a dozen workplace predators does not equate to true justice for working women, the rightful conviction of Michael Slager is far from full vindication for people of color. And we've seen this week white Americans who have been slain by police under dubious circumstances. Perhaps it's worth to note that Slager pled guilty and before his sentencing said, quote, "I wish I could go back in time and change the events, but I can't. I'm standing before the Scott family and the court and taking responsibility," end quote. And when Walter Scott's mother, Judy, looked directly at Slager from the stand, saying that she forgave him for the murder of her son, Mr. Slager cried. While I will never excuse the actions that put Officer Slager in this position, as a minister, I can respect the contrition that he has shown. That, as I said before, what we saw this week was an aberration, and one that is not likely to be repeated under the umbrella of the Trump Sessions Justice Department, one that has all but killed top-down the undefeated, and Jack Brewer, former NFL player and CEO of the Brewer Group. Let me start with you, Bill. As one that has been out there raising a lot of these issues, Eric Garner now and all the way back to Ferguson, I was heartened to see, what Kaepernick and others did, bring a new spotlight. But has that now been lost? We're now hearing that the owners are talking about giving millions of dollars to players to set up social justice. What will that do about the issues of police? What does that have to do with law enforcement and the issues of trying to straighten out the criminal justice system? Is this just a distraction and a payoff?
Well, it's hush money. And let me say this. I'm happy that Colin is being recognized.
Colin, I think
that's a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing.
No, I think he's done
it's a good message to young people that, just like Ali, that you will be recognized for standing. However, you're absolutely right. Remember, when he felt kneeling, he didn't kneel to get $100 million from the NFL.
It was to deal with the Gardner case, to deal with the Tamir Rice case. Money in athletes' foundations doesn't answer that. When Ali fought, Ali went to the Supreme Court and affirmed the right to have your religious views respected with war. We're dealing with law. We're not dealing with law here. We're dealing with donations here.
and also, as your next Dr. Mavoe, what they got is barely 1% of what the NFL is actually worth. But listen, okay, good. So you get some money. you know, everybody goes to the beach, but you're absolutely right. I think the thing of protest has been lost. In other words, it's kind of been muted. And the question is, okay, what's next? Where do we go? And see, the problem I think is that the NFL Players Association, which was complicit and invisible in this, I think DeMaurice Smith should be really called to task. It was his responsibility, the association, to put a philosophical backbone and spine behind this movement and give it some definition.
Did DeMaurice Smith reach out to the victims, the people that they were supposed to be kneeling for, deal with the people that were fighting these issues? I know I haven't spoke with them, but maybe it was others. Did they use this to go and deal with some ways of getting donations to try to quiet down what Colin and others did and not really deal with the issue, the fundamental issue?
They should not have. They did not aggressively pursue Kaepernick and those people who continue to kneel. There's still some players who are continuing to kneel, and that's not important.
And the issue's still alive. Jack, the problem, let me bring you into this. Jack, the problem is still there. It's not like we've resolved the issue. It's not like the Supreme Court did with Ali, saying, yes, they have a right to respect their religion. It's not that these courts have said, yes, we've got to deal with the police issues that they were kneeling for in the first place. This is not a sitcom here. This is real life.
Right.
Yes, it is. And Rev, you make some incredible points. You know, we've talked about this before. We need to find some focus here. I applaud the league for trying to make an effort, but at the same time, it's not really their responsibility to put real policy and put real focus on these conversations. But as for the players, I get asked the questions all the time. Where does sports and politics, where does that come together? And I happen to believe that we need to, as professional athletes, use our platform not just to advocate for things, but also find some solutions. We're educated men. I have 2 master's degrees, and there's a lot of guys in the National Football League who are very educated. We can actually go to Congress and talk about policy, right?
That's right.
We can get behind some of these and really put some definition behind what we're talking about, and that's where we have to get to. You're right, giving money to foundations, and I'm a huge philanthropist. I love to do charity work, but at the end of the day, it's about solutions, man, and we got to help find some.
And I think, Bill, here again is where I look at the Players Association. Where is this being directed? Fine, if they want to donate to foundations, are those foundations going to fight for criminal justice reform? Are those foundations going to be on the ground dealing with the issues? Or is this just hush money? And is it to just say, all right, Colin had his day, move on, and the victims in the future are left to go? President Trump tweeted this: getting closer and closer on the tax cut bill, shaping up even better than projected. House and Senate working very hard and smart. End result will be not only important, but special. The essence of the unified Republican vision gives corporations a massive tax break and caps and ends various individual deductions in exchange. But what does all that mean for your pocketbook? Well, when I want to know something about real economics, I go to the economic expert Julianne Malveaux. Dr. Malveaux is the president emerita of Bennett College. Dr. Malveaux, to the average person watching, what does this tax bill really mean?
In a word, it means that they're going to be screwed. I mean, there's a much more academic word I could use, but I think people understand. If you make less than $25,000, in the first 5 years, you might see about a $300 a year break, but then that's going to go away. So the evil in this tax bill is that the corporate cuts are permanent, but the individual cuts are temporary. So
the corporate cuts are permanent, and the corporate cuts are a lot more than $300. The corporate cuts is like from 39% down to, what is it,
20%. 20%, and they did a little 2% last week. 45 said, I don't care if it goes up to 22, which caused Republicans to start fighting because their commitment was to take it down to 20. They say they want it to be the same as it is in other developed countries, but with all the loopholes, the effective tax rate for corporations right now is about 20%.
So you get a 19% drop in percentage, which is billions upon billions of dollars for corporations. and the middle class gets $300 that gets eaten up with health costs?
Under $25,000. If you make around $75,000 a year, you're going to get about $2,000 in the short run. If you make 150 or so, you're going to get about $4,000. But that's going to go away. If you look at the size of this thing, it's $1.5 trillion roughly. $1 trillion of it goes to the corporations, and then about another $100 million is going for, or $100 billion is going for the. They get rid of the estate tax. They get rid of the automatic minimum, and then the other $300 billion, the other so the less than a third of it is going to the other people.
So $1.2 trillion goes to corporations and
the wealthy. Absolutely.
Now, when we look at the fact that they also are now saying that they're going to put the Affordable Care Act into this bill, what happens there?
Well, if they eliminate the individual mandate, it means that costs for everybody else will go up. Young people, people who are relatively healthy will say, well, you know, I don't need health insurance. But they will need it eventually. And the way that the insurance system works, you're in a pool. So you got the old, unhealthy people, you got the young, healthy people, it averages out. So basically, this is another way for them to get at the Affordable Care Act, which they've been trying to do since the beginning. Now, this is one where Susan Collins may hold out. She's been very...
Susan Collins, the senator.
Senator from Maine.
Right.
She's been very flexible. She played ball with her party so far, but she may hold out on this. The other thing that some senators and congresspeople, regardless of party, are likely to hold out on is the state and local taxes. Because if you live in a city like New York, you're talking about...
Or California or New Jersey.
Exactly. You have very high local taxes. This used to be deductible. Now it isn't. Yeah. And so that's what...
Under this law, you cannot deduct the state tax in those big states, which happen to be blue states.
Exactly. So, you know, I mean, there's so many things. When 45 was elected, he said that he was going to simplify the tax code. I don't know if you recall the news conference he had where he held up a postcard and said you could fill out your taxes with a postcard. But there's so many little gifts for the wealthy in here. As an example, if you have a 529, that's the tax deductible college fund. You're saying now they're opening up so you can use that money not just for college but for private schools. Now who's that? That's the wealthy who don't need that deduction anyway.
Right.
I mean, corporations are awash in cash right now. The wealthy clearly are getting richer. And yet we're giving them all these breaks with the odd theory that if you give corporations breaks, they will invest more and hire people. They're actually also giving them an investment break, so you can write off investments in equipment right away. Usually you have to depreciate it over a period of time. And then there's a break for repatriation. So if you've got a factory in Ireland, you bring it back to the United States, you're going to get a tax break. Well, that would seem like a good thing. They would have more money, but guess what they're going to do with it? You've heard two announcements already. Buy back their stock.
Right.
They're not planning to use it to hire people. They're planning to use it to buy back their stock.
Nowhere in history have we seen trickle down since we first heard about it with Reagan. It
doesn't work.
It just does not work for the average person. Maybe that's why they've tolerated such bizarre behavior from this president, because he's really altering the tax structure and tilting it for the rich.
Absolutely. The average person, if they see something, they'll see it, Reverend, in 4 or 5 years. But after those 5 years...
I had actually shot Scott down, and all of the ministers and the mayor even came and joined me and members of National Action Network at the site. And I called the local minister to pray and lead the prayer. His name was Reverend Clementa Pinckney. A few weeks later, I got a call that Reverend Pinckney had been killed in his church with 8 of his parishioners in Bible class. The man who prayed at the Scott scene became the central figure in the Charleston 9 massacre. So the struggle continues. You make one step forward, they push 2 back, but you got to keep going. Whether it's for rights for women, whether it's rights for LGBTQ, whether it's rights for blacks, whatever it is, you can't stop. What gives us the strength, I remember at Reverend Pinckney's funeral, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, broke out and sung that song, Amazing Grace. I guess that is really what a lot of freedom fighters in the Mississippi Museum of Civil Rights and those of us that are still on the scene, that's what we really believe, that grace will bring us on. And sometimes in the middle of having to depend on grace, you might feel lonely, you might feel awkward, but history says you have to keep going. You can't give up. You depend on that grace, not regular grace, but amazing grace. That does it for me. Thanks for watching. I'll see you back here next Sunday. Let's send it over to Alex Witt. Alex?
Can I say an amen to what you just said? That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you always.
And you too, my friend. Thank you so much. Good to see all of you, and a good morning at that. I'm Alex Witt here at MSNBC World Headquarters in New York. It is just about 9 a.m. in the east, 6 a.m. out west, and here's what's happening. Down to the wire, a new poll suggesting the Alabama Senate race is a toss-up. We're going to look at whether one side might have an edge because of some last-minute moves.
That's big stuff. Those are very big phrases, very big words.
Museum fallout, how the president's remarks at the Civil Rights Museum are playing, and whether there are any important takeaways. A day in the life, a new report on President Trump's Oval Office routine. Insiders spill what the president's day is like and his apparent addiction to a diet soda. Republicans insist their tax plan is a break for the middle class, a new report suggesting otherwise. So where is the truth? But new this morning, last-ditch efforts ahead of Alabama's special election on Tuesday, including President Trump's most direct involvement yet in his support of Roy Moore. The White House confirming to NBC that the president has recorded a robo-call for the embattled candidate, although it's unclear at what point in the next 2 days those calls will begin. Meanwhile, Democrats are banking on prominent lawmakers to get out the black vote, a crucial voting bloc that could send Doug Jones to Washington. New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, he's hitting the ground again with Jones today after stumping beside him yesterday.
I'm here to try to help to get some folk woke. Those people that don't understand the opposite of justice is not injustice, it is indifference, it is inaction, and it is silence. I've seen that bad people get elected when good people don't vote.
And there was a new poll this morning showing Roy Moore with a 4-point lead, now just 2 days away. Our coverage this morning kicking off with NBC's Jeff Bennett. He's covering the president in Florida. Gabe Gutierrez following the final hours of that contentious Senate battle in Alabama for us. And we start in Selma, Alabama. And with a good morning to you, Gabe. I know you've been down there for, a month or so now covering this race. What are you sensing down there with just 2 days out from this vote?
Hi there, Alex. Good morning. Well, you mentioned Cory Booker campaigning for Doug Jones over the weekend. Congressman John Lewis, civil rights icon, was supposed to be here today as well. We're standing in front of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that historic landmark where Lewis led that march on Bloody Sunday more than a half century ago. That has just been canceled due to weather and travel issues. But as for Doug Jones, a Democrat, he is making an urgent final push to turn out African-American voters.
Doug Jones is going to be able to count on your support.
This morning, as the scandalous Senate race that's gripped the nation wraps up its final weekend, Democrat Doug Jones is on the move.
I can't remember what day we're in now where Roy Moore is in hiding. He comes out only to be seen. He's kind of like the groundhog. He comes out ever so often to see whether or not he can see his shadow.
While denying allegations of sexual misconduct with teen girls decades ago, Republican Roy Moore has refused to answer questions from reporters at his limited campaign events. The Washington Post first broke the story of the youngest accuser, then 14-year-old Lee Korfman, more than a month ago.
It's simply dirty politics.
Many of his core supporters attended a Friday night rally for President Trump just over the state line in Florida.
I support Judge Moore 100%.
Days after officially endorsing Moore, the president recording a last-minute robocall on his behalf.
So get out and vote for Roy Moore.
Roy Moore is lying again.
Jones has been outspending Moore 10-1, running ads to try and peel off more moderate suburban Republicans disgusted with the allegations.
This is our time, Alabama.
Campaigning today with New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, trying to mobilize African-American voters. They make up more than a quarter of this deep red state's population. And in historic Selma, organizer Sam Walker is trying to make sure they show up.
Do you think that politicians have ignored this community?
Well, I don't know if they've ignored it. I think we have to do a better job of making sure that we need to have our voice at the table.
As for Roy Moore, he's essentially disappeared from the campaign trail, holding no public events since Tuesday. He does have a planned rally tomorrow with former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon, and a rare interview with local media is set to air later today, Alex.
I guess we're also keeping an eye to see if he wants to go to church today, because I guess that would be possible in a couple of hours. So we'll see if he shows up there as well. But you're right, nothing scheduled. Thank you so much, Gabe, for that. On the heels of that, let's bring in Yamiche Alcindor, MSNBC contributor and national political reporter for the New York Times. Also Paul Singer, Washington correspondent for USA Today. With a good morning to you both. Let's get right to it. Paul, what do you think the best case scenario is for Republicans come Tuesday night?
Well, the best case scenario for Republicans at this point is that they win this race. You know, it is true that Roy Moore is a tainted candidate, and he will arrive in the U.S. Senate as a tainted U.S. senator, and there's going to be a whole process that follows. It's not good for them if he is in an ethics investigation for past sexual misdeeds, particularly at this time in America. But they certainly don't want to lose this seat. It will be a historic defeat for the president, for the Republican Party, and could destabilize their majority in the U.S. Senate. The best case scenario for the Republicans, even if they don't like Roy Moore, is they still need to win this race.
How do you see it, Yamiche?
I mean, I think politically the best case scenario is for Roy Moore to win this seat. But I think if they win, they might pick up this seat and in the short term have a Republican vote that they may or may not be able to count on, because I think Roy Moore is going to be very hard to actually convince to vote on things just because it's a Republican agenda. I think Mitch McConnell understands that, and that's why he was, I think, at one point really pushing for him to step aside. But I think the larger question is whether or not Republicans can overcome now the stigma that this is going to bring on their party. You already have President Trump, who multiple women said acted sexually inappropriate towards them, and now you have to have a Senate candidate who is accused of molesting teenagers sit in the U.S. Senate. So Democrats, I think, are going to be able to use that message in the midterm and argue that the Republicans are essentially the party of sexual harassment and assault.
Hey, Paul, can I ask you, have you heard anything about all the clamorings to, were he to be elected, they would not seat him in the Senate? I mean, that seems to have somewhat fallen by the wayside.
Yeah, I think that's unlikely. It would be an extraordinary thing to flat out reject the result of the Alabama vote. What is more likely is that Roy Moore, assuming he wins this race, and he has a native advantage built in Alabama because there's this many Republicans and this many Democrats in Alabama. But what's more likely is that he arrives, he's kind of isolated in the U.S. Senate, an ethics investigation will begin almost immediately, and Roy Moore will basically be wandering the halls without a lot of friends, and as Yamiche said, it becomes a very interesting question of whether or not he plays along with the rest of the Republican agenda. I think it could be a fascinating time to watch. It is possible that Moore ultimately gets rejected from the Senate after an ethics investigation, but even that is extraordinarily unlikely.
Yeah. Well, to your hand diagram there, I'm curious about the impact lawmakers like John Lewis, Cory Booker, how are they going to affect the black voters at this late juncture?
Well, I think the theory is that they bring the Democratic and the black vote up a little bit. The question is whether it's enough to overcome the Republican advantage, which, again, is diminished a little bit by Roy Moore's sort of odd behavior in general and the allegations against him, specifically of sexual misconduct.
Yeah. Yamiche, do you think that had they come down to Alabama earlier, they might have had more of an opportunity to make an effect with the black vote? Because, you know, I think it's very hard to change minds typically this late in the game.
I think that there was a strategic decision made by a lot of Democrats. I've talked to aides for both Cory Booker and other aides in the House and in Congress. And essentially, they said the Democrats didn't want to nationalize this race because they didn't want to tell the people, they didn't want to seem like they were telling the people of Alabama what they knew best for them. Now we get into this point where African Americans are almost being counted on by the Democratic Party to save them from an issue that they long had before, which was that they didn't really have a state party structure. Doug Jones wasn't really getting a lot of support from the Democratic Party. Now you see these people coming in at the last minute. And while Cory Booker and John Lewis are people that are popular in the African American community, I don't know if people there are going to run to the polls, because at the end of the day, they're assessing Doug Jones, and Doug Jones should have been making that case all along.
Well, does Doug Jones, does his record on civil rights at all resonate with black voters? I mean, this is the guy that got justice for the 4 little girls that were killed in the church bombing.
I mean, I think that his record is going to speak more, I think, than Cory Booker coming down and saying, hey, I'm going to sit here and eat some and be in this church with you. I think Doug Jones making the case that I am someone who has been here, I am someone who has prosecuted people, I'm someone who has been in your corner, that's going to make a lot more impact. But I should say among African-American voters that I've talked to, they sometimes get really angry at the Democratic Party for feeling like they have to bail the party out. That you know, after the election, there were all these stories about whether or not African-Americans turned out enough, when at the end of the day, Donald Trump got a lot of votes from white women and white men. And I think there's an inherent tension there that you can't make the case to African-Americans that you have to save us. If not, it's going to be your fault.
Okay. Guys, sit tight right now. I'm going to go to Jeff Bennett, who's covering the very latest from the president, and he's in West Palm Beach, Florida. So, Jeff, with a good morning to you. As you know, this New York Times article has insight on Mr. Trump and the Oval Office. Talk about some of the highlights. I got to say, I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, it was. Good morning, Alex. This article by Maggie Haberman, Glenn Thrush, and Peter Baker really captures a day in the life of President Trump. It paints a portrait of a president who is learning on the job, learning in real time, and bringing into the presidency all of his idiosyncrasies, to include his steady diet of cable TV news. According to the article, the president has a 60-inch television mounted in the White House dining room that he watches throughout the day, sometimes on mute. And while he's watching it, according to the article, he consumes up to about 12 glasses of Diet Coke a day. And what he sees on cable TV often provides ammunition for what he posts on Twitter, which we know based on our own conversations with White House aides and associates to be true. The other interesting takeaway is the influence of White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, the retired four-star Marine general. John Kelly, in his own words, says that he doesn't necessarily perceive his role to be, that of trying to control the president, trying to control his Twitter feed. What he does try to control is the flow of information to the president. And here's a quote from the article. It says this: monitoring his information consumption and countering what Mr. Kelly calls garbage peddled to him by outsiders remains a priority for the chief of staff and the team he has made his own. Even after a year of official briefings and access to the best minds of the federal government, Mr. Trump is skeptical of anything that does not come from inside his bubble. And the last takeaway, I think, is sort of the difficult adjustment the president has made, in large part because of his own expectations of the presidency. The article says that the president thought he would have more of an imperial command, as opposed to having to work with, two other branches of government, a legislative branch, as we've seen often has, very different ideas of its own priorities, Alex.
Well, that would be the sentiments, I think, of a CEO of a business coming into it with that approach, certainly. Okay, Jeff Bennett, thanks for that. And I want to note to all of you, we're going to have Peter Baker, who was a co-author of that article, on our show today at 1 o'clock Eastern. I want to bring back Yamiche and Paul right now, though, and start with you, Yamiche. I want to put up an excerpt from your colleague's report. Despite all the bluster, he views himself less as a titan dominating the world stage than a maligned outsider engaged in a struggle to be taken seriously. Mr. Trump so far has arguably wrestled the presidency to a draw. Is this a reflection of the president's insecurities in your mind?
I think that this is a reflection of his deep-seated anger at the fact that people don't see him in a way that's more serious now that he's president. He thought, based on conversations that I've had with aides as well, that he was going to essentially have this respected place in history, that he was going to be able to be treated in some ways like President Obama was, that people were not going to make fun of him, that they were going to take him, when he said something, that it was going to not be something that was ended up on SNL. And what he's seeing essentially is a lot of his Secretary of State calling him a moron, so reportedly, and he's seeing people kind of make fun of him and laugh at him, and the people that he's supposed to be representing, you see American voters essentially saying, oh, that's just Donald going on again. So there's this real anger at him, and anger at the own Republican Party for not feeling as though that they're really acquiescing to his will.
Paul, I want to get to you about this before we go. The recent GOP efforts to try to discredit Special Counsel Robert Mueller, including by people who once praised him. You've got the Wall Street Journal reporting that some of the president's associates say they want the White House to set up a classic war room to respond to this probe. They want to hire attorneys more inclined to challenge Mr. Mueller or to spotlight what they see as an anti-Trump animus on the part of the special counsel. What's behind these efforts, Paul? Is it as simple as, the investigation entering the president's inner circle, or is it something else?
Well, this is also part of the president's long-term strategy, and has been all along, is to discredit anybody who disagrees with him. It's not that you're wrong, it's that you are a bad human. You are biased, you are fake news, you are corrupt in some way. This is the president and his allies who have said that the FBI is corrupt. Recently, in the past couple of weeks, this is the guy, he runs the FBI, right? I mean, they report to him. The Justice Department is corrupt. Everybody is inept and corrupt if you can question Donald Trump. He is all about discrediting any authority that can question his own authority. And so what you're seeing now, as Robert Mueller's investigation progresses and gets closer and closer to Trump and the Oval Office, you see an increased effort to discredit any kind of credibility that Mueller and the FBI, the investigation, might have with the American public. Make them look like they're just biased political hacks. That's the Trump strategy.
Okay. Paul Singer, Yamiche Alcindor, thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Civil rights leader John Lewis was among those to boycott the opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum because of President Trump's attendance. Was that a missed opportunity to confront the president or a rightful protest? I'll ask Congressional Black Caucus member Brenda Lawrence next.
To be a place where every child from every background can grow up free from fear, innocent of hatred, and surrounded by love, opportunity, and hope. Today, we pay solemn tribute to our heroes of the past and dedicate ourselves to building a future of freedom, equality, justice, and peace.
President Trump yesterday during a controversial visit to the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, Mississippi, an event which set off a boycott by civil rights icon John Lewis and Mississippi Congressman Benny Thompson, also a leader in the movement. Joining me now, Democratic Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence of Michigan. She is a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, also the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Congressman, with a welcome to you. First, your reaction to what you heard in that clip and what you wanted to hear from President Trump.
It was the most sedated speech I've heard in a long time from the president. It was almost as if it was uncomfortable for him to read it. This is about not what you say, but what you do. When he's talking about the past and the icons, there is still a movement in America for equality. You take the example of our football players kneeling. He called them son of a bitches. When you look at people who are protesting on the street, and he said, well, there's good on both sides. When you look at our Civil Rights Department that investigates, that look at how we can move as a country in a way to eliminate civil rights violation, he's gutted it. It is not about you showing up for a photo op. It is about what you do. And sometimes, if you can't hear us, maybe there's another way to get your attention, Mr. President.
Do you think Congressman Lewis could have delivered your message, a message he would no doubt share, were he to have attended the ceremony?
Mr. Lewis has to make his own decisions, and I can tell you from his history of being on the ground, taking the sacrifice, the beatings, and understanding civil rights, I would lean to the judgment of John Lewis, an icon in civil rights. Can you imagine what it must have been for him not to be there for the opening of an institution that would educate generations to come of what happened in the past? But we still have an opportunity. This is a time, I hope the president understood that this is a plea, this is a cry for our country to again embrace civil rights, to make sure that we're not flipping back the page. And I can tell you in Black America, that's what it feels like. We have a president who blatantly and openly discredits people who, when they're crying from the street with their civil disobedience, and he'll say, ignore them, kick them out, fire them, and call them names. We need to move forward with sitting at the table, funding the Civil Rights Department.
Well, in terms of moving things forward, I want to play for you what Congressman Emanuel Cleaver told me yesterday. Take a listen to this.
Donald Trump is my president. I don't want the president to fail and mess up and tear the country apart. There's no value to me. So my hope is that he would do the right thing and follow through. If he comes back Monday and does something substantive, I will beg you to allow me to come on the show and praise him.
Do you and other CBC members share that sentiment? I mean, how can the president's relationship with the CBC be repaired?
It started off where we were invited to the White House to talk about Black America, what do you have to lose? We sat down with the president. We had a substantive conversation. We gave documents to him. Mr. President, if you want a better relationship with Black America, if you really want to hear from us, here are our concerns. We have had nothing as a result of that. We had the photo op, we had the discussion. When you are trying to engage people, it's more than just photo ops and one conversation. The Civil Rights Department is a major step. Engage. We look at his appointments on judgeships. We look at his administration. And you don't have to have a Black person to engage, because the civil rights movement didn't happen with all Blacks. We have had white presidents that have understood and been leaders in civil rights movement. The president has a long way to go. His circles, Mr. Sessions, we said from the very beginning, Mr. President, we have concerns, because here is a person who historically have not been respectful of the civil rights movement. And look at what we just got with Moore. Him saying one of the better times in America was families were stronger. We were slaves. We weren't even allowed to name our children. We were not allowed to keep our families because they were sold off. How in the world can you say in America that's when we were great because we had great families? And as African Americans, we're sitting there saying, my goodness.
Yeah.
Well. Really? In 2017, and Mr. President, you're doing robocalls and embracing. Let's not even talk about being a sexual predator on children.
Yeah. Look, I can't even comment to that Roy Moore statement. I mean, it makes zero sense. That said, may I quickly get to the Alabama Senate race, because your colleague, yes, Congressman John Lewis, I mean, he is showing up for this. Senator Cory Booker as well, out campaigning for Doug Jones. But shouldn't the Democratic Party have gotten on the ground earlier to try to galvanize African-American voters? And may I also ask you to react to Yamiche Alcindor? You may have heard in the last segment, she said, in essence, that people, they, meaning the Black community, often get really angry at the Democratic Party for feeling like they have to bail the party out.
We have been on the ground. So whoever is saying that, we've been on the ground, we've been working, because we know that this is an opportunity for us to build our base, for us to reach out, and then not to even mention the type of candidate that they're promoting. He is against all of the values and what we stand for as a Democratic Party. But let me tell you this, the Democratic Party had a slap in the face in this last election, and we have been growing. We've been having those conversations. So the history of, and some of the disappointments in the past, the Democratic Party understands clearly that we have work to do. And when it comes to bailing out the elections, we are talking about those core things that belong in America, we feel. Clearly, civil rights. My goodness, we're talking about sexual harassment. We're calling for sitting members to resign. My goodness, how can we bring in a person that we know have multiple allegations of being a sexual assaulter? Now, in addition to that, let's talk about civil rights in the South. Let's talk about education. Let's talk about sensible gun control. And if I can say this a million times, when you talk about gun control, I would never say take away your right to own a gun. But if we can regulate how you drive a car, you have to have a license, you have to get your license renewed, and you have to operate it safely, and we put airbags in it. My goodness, the only purpose of a gun is to kill someone. Why wouldn't we have sensible gun control laws so that we can safely own and operate our guns? Well, and here you are, you have a person who is clearly out of sync. And I tell you, the Republican Party, I don't understand where they're going with this. Yep. I really don't.
Well, to your statements on guns, I'm going to actually applaud you, because you're 100% correct on that. Michigan Democratic Congressman Brenda Lawrence, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
The tax plan, the GOP says it is a break for the middle class, but everyone else says otherwise. So who's lying? But before we head to a break, Saturday Night Live's Santa Claus explains who's on this year's naughty list. Take a look.
I guess you could say that Al Franken is on Santa's naughty list this year.
And what about Roy Moore? Which list is he on?
It's not really a list, it's more of a registry.
Is President
In New York at 31 past the hour, here's what we're monitoring for you. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in Paris this morning for a meeting at Élysée Palace with the French President Emmanuel Macron. And their meeting originally was to be focused on Iran, but that has expected, rather, to shift to the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. Now, Macron was the first European leader to call President Trump and warn him about the instability that the capital announcement could cause. We're going to delve more into the significance of all this in just a little bit with former U.S. Ambassador Christopher Hill. But let's go now to politics and the new reaction from the Roy Moore campaign as the embattled candidate is trying to capitalize on President Trump's full-throated endorsement. Here's Moore's chief strategist just moments ago.
Well, President Trump's support is very, very important for the people of Alabama and this nation. You see, this is President Trump's agenda, and that's why it's so important that Judge Moore win this race. Last night we had Doug Jones, the liberal Democrat, with one of his Senate buddies, Cory Booker, who said that the president should resign. So this is Donald Trump on trial in Alabama. If the people of Alabama vote for this liberal Democrat, Doug Jones, then they're voting against the president who they put in office at the highest level.
But the state's senior U.S. Senator refusing to get on board with President Trump and the RNC. Here's Senator Richard Shelby moments ago.
There's a time, we call it a tipping point. And I think so many accusations, so many cuts, so many drip, drip, drip. When it got to the 14-year-old story, that was enough for me. I said, I can't vote for Roy Moore.
Also new today, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, one of the first to call on fellow Democrat Senator Al Franken to resign with a series of 5 tweets condemning President Trump, Roy Moore, and GOP Congressman Blake Farenthold. She says Republicans should join Democrats in holding them accountable for their actions. Gillibrand writing, the accusations against Moore are disgusting, and President Trump has admitted on tape to how he treats women. Let's bring in Adrian Elrod, former Director of Strategic Communications for Hillary Clinton's campaign, and MSNBC analyst Robert Traynham, former Bush Cheney senior advisor. With a good day to both of you, I'll get right to it, Adrian. This new article out this morning, Adrian, in the Hill, it's citing some Democrats that are critical of Gillibrand for her criticism of Franken and former President Clinton. Are these tweets that we're just seeing today, do you think they're in reaction to that possibly? Do you think she woke up and just decided to pull a Donald Trump and start tweeting? I mean, what do you think behind it?
Well, look, Senator Gillibrand has been an absolute champion for women. She, has long been a supporter of reducing sexual assault incidences in the military, and she's been such a champion on the sexual assault and sexual harassment issue that we've been dealing with in Congress. So I'm glad that she's leaning into this. Her voice is so strong. Maybe she is tweeting in retaliation to some criticism that she had. But, look, I agree with her completely in the sense that if you've ever committed sexual harassment or sexual assault, you should not be in Congress. And if you are in Congress and you have these allegations lodged against you and they have not come out yet, you probably should expect them to do so. So I applaud everything that she's doing, and I hope that she keeps going out there and fighting for victims of sexual assault like she has been.
Yeah. Robert, does this feel to you like it could be kind of a part 2 of a campaign? Democrats ousting Senator Franken on lesser charges, so now they have license to go after Roy Moore, Blake Farenthold, and, of course, the big prize, the president. What do you think?
Absolutely. Look, first and foremost, all of these situations when it comes to members of Congress, members of the media and so forth, sexually assaulting women and sexual harassment is completely and totally wrong. What I do believe here, wearing my partisan hat for a second, is that Democrats are using this as a political weapon and basically becoming the moral high ground or the moral authority on this issue. And candidly speaking, I think they're doing a very good job at this. And if you juxtapose that against Kirsten Gillibrand, I do think that she probably will be on the short list for 2020. I do think that she will use this in a way that says, look, I was one of the lone voices, not only nationally, but also in my own party to stand up to this. And you got to remember, you know, women make up a significant amount of the electorate. 50% of women voted for Hillary. I think 60% of women voted for Hillary Clinton. So, and the reality is, when you look at it from a political standpoint, this makes a lot of sense on the Democratic front.
So yesterday, Adrian, I spoke with Norm Armstein. I'm sure you know him, resident scholar there at the American Enterprise Institute, also a longtime friend of Senator Al Franken. We talked about his resignation announcement, and here's what he told me.
I'd trust him with my life. He is a remarkable human being, and I'm uneasy very much about the way this whole thing played out. If we can't go through a process, at least an ethics process, where you can hash these things out and begin to have a set of punishments that fit the nature of what's going on here, we're heading down a difficult path.
So do you agree? Did Democrats go too far by forcing Senator Franken to resign?
Well, look, I think this issue is very, very difficult. You know, Senator Franken, you know, perhaps in several years from now, even maybe several months, we'll look back and say, you know, did he take the sword here for, you know, for future members in terms of how to handle this? So it's really difficult to look at this and really make a determination, I think, at this point right now. But look, the longer that Senator Franken was going to be in the Senate, the more distracting he would become. More and more women came forward. You know, I think it was the 7th woman who came forward with an allegation that really, you know, set off the female members of the Senate into calling for his resignation. So, you know, time will tell, I think, is where we are in this. I thought his forced speech was incredible. He drew such a contrast between him and the fact that it's so ironic that the President of the United States, who has 19 women and counting, who have accused him of sexual harassment, and he's still in office and he can't be removed because of that. He certainly drew contrast there. So time will tell. I think time will tell.
So, Robert, Alabama Senate race a couple days away now. The president is certainly making a big pitch to voters for Roy Moore. Let's take a look at what he said in a rally on Friday night.
We want people coming into our country who love our people, support our economy, and embrace our values. It's time to get our priorities straight. This guy's screaming, "We want Roy Moore." He's right.
Shouldn't the president be conflating Republican values with a vote for Roy Moore?
What the president is doing, notice he's wearing red, white, and blue. Notice he's saying our values. If you push out of that shot a little bit, there's this huge sign that says Merry Christmas. This is all code, Alex. This is code to Alabama saying our values, meaning the way America used to be. It's not Happy Holidays. It's Merry Christmas. It's the president looking like presidential, like the American flag, and wrapping himself around that. This is all about turning out a very conservative 1950s America base for Roy Moore. This is what this is. And also remember that this is in a media market where Roy Moore really needs to pump up that base in order for him to win come Tuesday. So anyone with a political lens, or anyone who's spent any time in Alabama, I've been to the state 3 times now, and you can see exactly what the president's doing. He's crazy like a fox.
All right, Adrian, I want to ask you about a report in the New York Times about Harvey Weinstein. And I'm just going to tell, I know you've been asked about this before, but for the viewers that haven't heard about this yet, the report says the Clinton campaign had been warned about Harvey Weinstein's behavior. And it reads, quote, in 2016, actress Lena Dunham said she was troubled by the producer's visible presence during Mrs. Clinton's presidential run. Ms. Dunham said she told Christina Sheikh, the campaign's deputy communications director, she said that Ms. Sheikh seemed surprised at her warning, that Ms. Sheikh said that she would tell Robbie Mook, the campaign manager. Ms. Dunham said she also warned Adrian Elrod. As far as Ms. Dunham could tell, the campaign had not responded to her concerns about Mr. Weinstein. So what is your response to that? Is it true that nobody responded to Lena Dunham's concerns?
Look, my response is I certainly don't remember that conversation that way. Ms. Dunham was one of our most active surrogates on the campaign. She was incredibly effective, especially with young millennial women. But I don't recall that conversation that way, and I can certainly assure you that I would have come forward if the allegations that we now know to be true
How do you recall the conversation?
Well, look, I don't want to get into private discussions that I had with our surrogates on the campaign. And by the way, I did run the full surrogate operation, so I had a lot of conversations with a lot of celebrities, a lot of elected officials, a lot of high wattage influencers every single day. And I'm certainly not going to divulge those conversations on air, but I also don't recall every single minute of every conversation that I had.
Okay. Robert, I want to get quickly to the president's remarks at the Civil Rights Museum dedication in Mississippi yesterday. He spoke about civil rights heroes. Did his remarks do anything to ease the tensions that were surrounding his visit?
I think a little bit. You know, look, as you know me, Alex, I call it just the way I see it.
You do.
And I read the president. I didn't see it, but I read the president's speech this morning. I actually thought it was a very well-written speech. And I actually thought it did a very good job of speaking of, quite frankly, what I just mentioned a few moments ago, the America of yesteryear and how much we need to progress and how much we haven't progressed. So I do think it was right. Look, he's our president. You know, you can make a lot of bones about his tweets and about some of his behavior, but he is our president and he represents us. Now, that's a different conversation about whether or not he does it well or not. But the reality is that he should have been there, and I actually thought the speech was a very good speech.
Can I just say something? Do you ever find, though, if you read something, and I'm not, saying you didn't watch it, sometimes things can be written one way for this president, but the delivery is a whole nother matter.
Well, we know that this president speaks extemporaneously. We know that he does not follow the teleprompter. We know that he's not a scripted person. But, again, I did not see the speech, so I don't know exactly. I believe what I read is what he said. It was actually a transcript. And assuming that that's true, again, I stand by what I said.
Just a few moments ago on the U.S. decision to move its embassy to Jerusalem. Now her comments come on a fourth day of rage in the Middle East following that announcement. Today's demonstrations taking place outside the U.S. embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. Security forces firing tear gas as protesters threw stones. Joining me now, Christopher Hill, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq. He is also an MSNBC diplomacy expert. With a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning.
Talk about Mr. Trump's move. What will it actually do? How long is it, first of all, going to take to play out?
Well, first of all, it'll take a long, long time to play out. I mean, I doubt the U.S. Embassy is in any way prepared to move. Obviously, they have to get funds from Congress to do that. They have to find a site. And I think they're going to have to live up to the security standards. I don't see any wavering of security standards if you're really going to move into Jerusalem. It's really an extraordinary step. It's part and parcel of a view that no one who's come before has made any sense or made any progress. So essentially, this is an administration that's decided not only to defy the Palestinians and the Arab world, but frankly the rest of the world as well. This was to be a final status issue, a so-called issue where you sit down after doing 98% of the problem and then you go after this one. And he simply put it in reverse order, and it's not at all clear what he's gotten from this diplomatically or in any other way. So very strange from a policy point of view.
You just heard Nikki Haley there calling it courage. Some say it's folly. Where do you fall?
Well, I'm not really sure what she means. I can certainly understand the move from a political point of view in the U.S., who supported the president, what their expectations may have been as a result of their support. But I don't see any kind of follow-up process that would put it in the sort of even the parking lot of courage. So I'm not really quite sure what she means. Presumably, it's the notion that the U.S. will do certain things, and perhaps they'll come in on some other side of the ball, supporting the Palestinians in ways that are unexpected. But I kind of doubt it. I think this was pretty much of a political payoff, and to call it courage, I'm not sure is particularly accurate or much less relevant.
If we look back to 1995, Congress then approved the recognition of Jerusalem in the Embassy Act. This happened under President Clinton. No president since has enforced it. Why not?
Well, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't put that in the category of courage either. I think Congress knew that in approving this, no administration until this administration would have acted on it. So I think this was a case of what one would call posturing, and certainly nobody's come close to wanting to do this until this current president.
Well, then, sir, may I ask you, was it lip service that was being paid back in 1995 then?
Yeah, I think lip service is a polite way to put it. Yes, I think that's exactly what's been going on. It's been going on for quite a while. Look, everyone who has any inkling of the peace process has understood the sort of major lift that this involves, that is making Jerusalem, making, in fact, occupied territories, because that's what East Jerusalem is, occupied territories into the Israeli capital, is a major, major development. And so what the U.S. has done over the years, what everyone's done over the years, is to say, hey, this is a major deal. We need to get into a process, and at the final stage of the process, that is when Jerusalem needs to be discussed. And by the way, it was never clear how it would eventually turn out. Would the Palestinians get East Jerusalem as their capital, as is the context of the two-party solution? But in any case, this would be a final issue where you look at 98% of the deal being done, and then you do the last 2%. So instead, it's been front-loaded for no particular reason.
Christopher Hill.